His hand closed around her bleeding fingers, and the entire hall held its breath. She did not look away. The candles trembled, casting shadows that danced like accusations across their faces. And for the first time in her life, she understood that shame could belong to someone else. Before we dive into this story, leave your rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're watching from. May this moment reach your heart. The House of Ancient Mirrors shuddered beneath the weight of wind when she arrived. A young woman of generous form and submissive gaze, wrapped in a dress that did not belong to her. They brought her by force, as if her presence stained the marble stairs, as if the air around her required purification after each step she took. No one spoke her name aloud. She was merely the punishment, the offering, the disgrace that the master would receive tonight. Inside, the castle held its breath suspended. The place seemed made of stone and blood, with corridors so narrow that the echo of footsteps sounded like a contained lament. Mirrors lined every wall, and in each one reflected a woman who did not wish to see herself. The round face, the firm chin, the heavy shoulders, the skin of someone who had carried shame for far too long. She clutched the moon-shaped pendant at her neck, a gift from her mother before exile, symbol of something she no longer knew if she believed in. Dignity, perhaps. They said the vampire tolerated neither light nor mercy, that he fed on obedience, on fear, on silence. When he appeared, the entire hall lost temperature. The candelabras wavered, and a metallic perfume mixed with the air, as if night itself had spilled inside. His gaze held a cruel serenity, and every look cast upon her was a sentence. No one dared breathe. The young woman bowed her head, awaiting judgment, but he did not speak. He merely observed her as one might study an enigma. Time seemed to disobey him. The room, once full, reduced itself to two beings breathing the same fear. His gaze, deep as still water, traveled her contours without hurry, not with immediate desire, but with shadowed fascination, as if this flesh, disdained by the world, carried a force he himself did not comprehend. She had been raised in the orphanage at the edge of the village, where girls learned to disappear into walls and make themselves useful through silence. The matrons there had spoken to her in whispers of correction, their voices sharp as winter wind through cracked windows. From childhood, she understood that her body was a transgression, that the space she occupied was too much, that her hunger was somehow evidence of moral failing. The other girls had been adopted one by one, chosen for their delicate frames and downcast eyes. She remained, growing taller and rounder with each passing season, until even the matrons stopped pretending she had prospects. When the summons came, she thought at first it was mercy. The castle needed servants, they said, but the way they dressed her, the way they bound her wrists with silk that cut like wire, the way they refused to meet her eyes during the journey, told her everything she needed to know. This was not employment. This was penance for the crime of existence. The carriage ride had lasted 3 days through forests that grew darker with each mile. The two men who escorted her spoke only to each other, their words careful and low, as if discussing cargo that might spoil. At night, they chained her to a tree while they slept, and she watched the moon through branches, wondering if her mother's spirit could see her now. The pendant grew cold against her skin, a small weight of silver that reminded her there had once been someone who called her beloved. In the following days, the castle whispered. The servants gossiped that she still lived, that she slept in a room of black curtains, that he had ordered her clothing replaced with fine fabrics. Others said she had bewitched him, that there was something profane in the way she walked. Slow steps, firm, almost defiant. And the more they despised her, the more he drew near. At meals, he watched her in silence, his eyes fixed, as if each gesture of hers was a prayer. She learned the rhythm of the castle through its shadows. Dawn never truly came here. The light that filtered through the heavy drapes was grey and hesitant, as if afraid to commit to morning. The corridors stretched longer than they should, turning back on themselves in geometries that defied reason. Servants moved through the halls like ghosts, their footsteps muted, their eyes averted whenever she passed. She understood quickly that she existed in a category beyond their comprehension. Not quite prisoner, not quite guest, something unnamed that disturbed the order of things. Her room was in the eastern tower, high enough that she could hear the wind conversing with itself around the stones. The bed was too soft, the kind of softness that made her bones ache with the memory of harder surfaces. Someone had left a silver brush on the vanity, and when she touched it, her reflection in the mirror seemed to belong to a stranger. This woman had colour in her cheeks, fabric that moved like water across her shoulders, hair that caught light like dark honey. She turned away quickly, disturbed by the intimacy of seeing herself transformed. The matrons attempted to intervene, fearing the ruin of hierarchies. They filled her ears with warnings and humiliations. "Remember your place," they said. "You are punishment, not choice." And still she maintained her steady gaze, even when their words burned like iron. Something in her had begun to shine beneath the weight of contempt, a flame the vampire saw even when she tried to hide it. Lady Seraphine was the worst of them. Tall and angular, with a face like a marble saint, and a voice that could flay skin from bone, she held court in the morning room where the senior staff gathered to distribute orders. She had served the master's family for 40 years, she announced frequently, and she understood the proper order of things. When the young woman entered to receive her daily instructions, Lady Seraphine would pause in whatever she was saying, letting silence grow until everyone turned to stare. "Your dress is wrinkled," she would say, though it was not. "Your hair is improper. Your presence disturbs the harmony of this household. Do you understand what you are? You are correction made flesh. You are here to remind the master of why standards exist. When he tires of this experiment, you will return to whatever darkness spawned you, and we shall speak of you as a lesson learned." The other women nodded, their faces composed in practiced sympathy that failed to hide their relief at not being the target. One of them, a woman named Helena, with kind eyes and anxious hands, sometimes left fresh bread by her door at night, wrapped in cloth that smelled of rosemary. But even Helena would not meet her eyes in daylight, would not risk association when others might see. The master himself remained an absence that shaped every moment. She caught glimpses. A shadow moving through a doorway, the sound of his voice from a distant room, the way conversations stopped when he approached. The servants spoke of him in the conditional tense, as if he were a force of nature rather than a man. If the master wishes, should the master require, when the master decides. His will was law, but the law itself was written in a language she could not yet read. One evening, as she stood by the window of her tower room watching clouds gather over the mountains, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside, not the soft shuffle of servants, but deliberate steps that made the floor vibrate with authority. She turned from the window, her heart suddenly loud in her chest, and watched the door as if she could see through it. The footsteps stopped outside her room. She could hear breathing, measured and calm on the other side of the wood. A minute passed, then another. She waited, hands clasped around the moon pendant, feeling the metal warm beneath her palms. The air seemed to thicken, pressing against her skin like water. Then the footsteps retreated, slow as they had come, and she released a breath she had not known she was holding. When she finally opened the door, the corridor was empty except for a single white rose placed on the threshold. Its petals were edged with frost, and when she lifted it, the stem was cold enough to ache. She kept the rose on her windowsill, watching it through the days that followed. It did not wilt. It did not even seem to change, frozen in that moment of perfect bloom, defying time the way everything in the castle seemed to defy natural law. At night, she would touch its petals and wonder what it meant to receive beauty from something that should not know how to give it. The castle's library became her refuge. She discovered it by accident, following a draft of warmer air through a series of turns that she could never quite retrace. The room was circular, books rising in spirals toward a domed ceiling painted with constellations she did not recognize. A fireplace burned with flames that gave no smoke, and leather chairs clustered around it like old friends in conversation. No one stopped her from entering. No one questioned her right to be there. She chose books at random at first, running her fingers along spines until something called to her. Poetry in languages she could not name, histories of empires that had left no trace, illustrated manuscripts showing gardens that grew in impossible colors. She learned that the castle had belonged to his family for 7 generations, that it had been built on ruins of something older, that the foundation stones hummed if you pressed your ear against them in certain rooms. And she learned about him, though never directly. His portrait hung in the gallery, a young man with dark eyes and a mouth that suggested he had forgotten how to smile. Painted 200 years ago according to the small brass plate, though the face was the same one she glimpsed in corridors. The artist had caught something in his expression, a kind of resigned sorrow, as if he were already mourning what he would become. On certain nights, one particular night, during the banquet of lords, the atmosphere became a trap. Wine flowed thick as blood, and the young woman was summoned to the hall. They ordered her to serve at the table before everyone as a servant. The laughter was made of knives. The vampire watched, motionless, and no one knew if his silence was contempt or prelude to something greater. She had dressed carefully that evening, though she knew it would not matter. The black dress they had given her was simple, designed to make her invisible, but the fabric was fine enough that it whispered when she moved. She braided her hair into a crown around her head, the way her mother had taught her when she was small, before hunger and sickness had taken her. The moon pendant hung at her throat, catching what little light the candles gave. The banquet hall stretched vast as a cathedral, its ceiling lost in shadow. Long tables formed a horseshoe around the central floor, laden with silver platters and crystal glasses that fractured candlelight into rainbows. The nobles sat in order of precedence, their clothing rich with embroidery, their faces composed in expressions of bored entitlement. At the high table, elevated on a dais, the master sat alone, his chair more throne than furniture. When she entered carrying a tray of wine glasses, the conversation did not stop exactly. But it changed. Voices dropped to murmurs. Eyes tracked her movement across the floor. She felt their gazes like hands pressing against her, testing the boundaries of her composure. She kept her spine straight, her steps even, pouring wine with practiced steadiness despite the tremor in her wrists. Lord Ashford, a man whose wealth came from coal mines that destroyed lungs and futures, was the first to speak loudly enough for all to hear. "Tell me," he said, addressing the master though his eyes remained on her, "is this the fashion now at court? I had heard rumor of your new taste, but I confess I did not believe it until this moment." The master said nothing. His fingers rested on the stem of his glass, absolutely still. Encouraged by the silence, Lord Ashford continued, "Perhaps you mean to set a trend. Charity disguised as desire. A noble impulse, surely, though I question the execution." His wife tittered, hiding her mouth behind a fan. The young woman continued her circuit of the tables, her face expressionless. She had learned long ago how to leave her body, how to perform the necessary motions while her mind retreated somewhere safer. She thought of her mother's hands, capable and worn, kneading bread dough in the mornings. She thought of the moon through winter branches. She thought of anything except the room she was in. But when one of the nobles, a younger man emboldened by wine and company, deliberately knocked his glass to the floor as she approached, she could not retreat far enough. The crystal shattered in a spray of red, wine spreading across the marble like a wound. The man looked up at her with a smile that had teeth in it. "Clean it," he said simply. The hall fell silent. Every eye turned toward the high table, toward the master, waiting to see what he would permit. His expression remained unreadable, carved from stone and shadow. The young woman set down her tray carefully, smoothed her dress, and knelt to gather the broken pieces. The shards were sharp. Her fingers fumbled with the first one, and she felt the sting before she saw the blood. It welled bright against her pale skin, dripping onto the white marble, mixing with the wine until both became the same shade of sacrifice. She continued collecting the pieces, her vision blurring slightly, focusing on the task because to focus on anything else would be to shatter as thoroughly as the glass. She heard the sound of a chair being pushed back. Not quickly, not with anger, but with the deliberate weight of a decision made. Footsteps crossed the dais, descended the 3 steps to the main floor, approached with the inevitability of thunder after lightning. She did not look up, could not. Then a hand entered her field of vision, pale and strong, reaching not for the glass but for her bleeding fingers. She froze, kneeling there with crystal digging into her knees as he lifted her hand into the light. His touch was cool, not cold, and so gentle it made her throat tight. The master studied her wound with the same attention he gave to everything, as if the sight of her blood held answers to questions he had not yet learned to ask. The hall held its breath. Time seemed to thicken, stretching the moment into something that would be remembered, retold, transformed into legend. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that everyone had to strain to hear it. The shame, he said, belongs to those who cause it. He helped her to her feet, his hand still holding hers, and the contact sent heat through her arm, into her chest, until she felt it burning behind her ribs. He did not release her immediately. Instead, he turned to face the assembled nobles, and in his eyes was something that made them shrink in their seats. "This woman," he continued, his voice still soft but carrying a weight that pressed against every ear, "has more grace in her smallest gesture than all of you possess in your entirety. You who inherit honor and mistake it for virtue. You who wear your cruelty like fashion and call it tradition. You are dismissed, all of you. Leave my house." No one moved at first, too shocked to process the words. Then Lord Ashford stood, his face purple with outrage. "You cannot mean to shame us for her sake. She is nothing. She is less than nothing." The master's expression did not change, but the temperature in the hall dropped so suddenly that breath became visible. "I will not repeat myself," he said. They left. Chairs scraped back, fabric rustled, voices rose in protest, and then faded into the corridors beyond. Within minutes, the vast hall stood empty except for two figures illuminated by candlelight, a vampire lord who had chosen to feel, and a young woman learning what it meant to be seen. He led her from the hall without speaking, her hand still clasped in his, her blood still warm between their palms. They walked through corridors she did not recognize, climbing stairs that curved impossibly, until they reached a room she had never entered. His study, she realized, taking in the dark wood and leather bindings, the fireplace that burned with blue flame, the windows that overlooked the forest stretching black and endless toward distant mountains. He released her hand only to retrieve a basin of water and clean cloth from a cabinet. She stood uncertainly by the door, unsure of protocol, while he returned and gestured toward a chair by the fire. "Sit," he said, and though it was a command, his tone held something else. "Request, perhaps?" "Or plea." She sat. He knelt before her, this lord of shadows and centuries, and cleaned her wounded hand with movements that spoke of practice, of other injuries tended in other times. The cloth was soft, the water warm, and his fingers against her skin were careful in a way that made her chest ache with an emotion she could not name. "Why?" she asked, and the word came out rougher than she intended. "Why defend me? Why care what they think? Why any of this?" He did not answer immediately. He finished cleaning her hand, examined the cuts to ensure no glass remained, then reached for bandages that he wrapped with methodical precision. Only when he was done, when her hand was bound in white linen that already showed spots of red seeping through, did he finally meet her eyes? Because he said slowly, as if testing each word before releasing it, "I have lived too long believing I knew what hunger was. I thought it was the blood, the darkness, the endless succession of nights. But when I saw you that first evening, when you stood in my hall and refused to make yourself smaller despite everything they said, despite everything they believed about you, I understood I had been wrong. Hunger is not what sustains us. It is what we do not permit ourselves to want." She stared at him. This creature who should not feel, whose reputation was built on coldness and cruelty, and saw in his face something she recognized. Loneliness. Not the brief isolation of days or weeks, but the kind that calcified around the heart until you forgot there had ever been anything else. "What do you want?" she whispered. He stood, moving to the window, his back to her. The firelight cast his shadow across the floor, stretching it until it touched her feet. For a long time he said nothing, and she thought perhaps he would not answer. Then, "I want to remember what it feels like to see something beautiful without needing to possess it, to hear laughter that does not stem from fear, to touch another soul and have it touch back without calculation or terror. I want to be human again, even if only for a moment, even if I never was." The words hung in the air between them, raw as her bleeding hand. She rose from the chair, crossed the space separating them, and stood beside him at the window. Below, the forest stretched infinite, and above, stars wheeled through their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small dramas of creatures bound to earth. "You are human," she said softly, "more human than those who just left." They choose their cruelty. You choose despite what you are. He turned to her then, and in his eyes she saw something break open, some door long locked finally giving way. His hand rose slowly, trembling slightly, and touched her cheek with the kind of gentleness that comes from practice denying yourself what you most want. She did not flinch, did not look away, let herself be seen in all her imperfect reality, and saw him see her, truly see her for the first time. The scandal spread like fire through the castle and beyond. Servants fled, nobles retreated in fear. Letters arrived daily, sealed with the crests of powerful families, demanding explanation, threatening consequence. The young woman, now protected by the monster's shadow, found herself at the center of a destiny no one dared to name aloud. Lady Seraphine appeared in her tower room one morning, her face drawn tight with fury, barely contained beneath courtly manners. She carried with her an air of righteousness that filled the space until it became difficult to breathe. "You have destroyed everything," she said without preamble. 40 years I have maintained order in this house. 40 years of ensuring that standards are met, that the old ways are honored, that the master understands his position in the world. And you, with your deliberate seduction, your calculated victimhood, have undone it all. The young woman, who had been brushing her hair by the window, set down the silver brush and turned to face her accuser. She said nothing, having learned that silence was often the most powerful response. Lady Seraphine continued, her voice rising. "Do you think this will last? Do you imagine he truly cares for you? You are a novelty, a rebellion against expectation, a way for him to assert dominance over those who question his authority. When the point is made, when the lesson is learned, you will be discarded like any other amusement. And I will be here to collect the pieces and restore what you have broken." Still the young woman said nothing. She met Lady Seraphine's eyes steadily, and in the silence between them something shifted. The older woman's certainty wavered just slightly, as if she had glimpsed something in the young woman's face that did not match her assumptions. "You think yourself special," Lady Seraphine said, but her voice had lost some of its conviction. "You think your defiance makes you strong, but strength is knowing your place and accepting it. Strength is serving the greater order without question. Strength is sacrifice." "No," the young woman said finally, her voice quiet but clear. "That is not strength. That is surrender dressed in virtue. Real strength is surviving what tries to make you small. Real strength is standing in your truth when the entire world insists you are wrong. And if that makes me defiant, then I will wear that label gladly." Lady Seraphine's face went rigid. She turned without another word and left, but the young woman could hear her footsteps in the corridor afterward, pacing back and forth as if unable to decide what to do next. Eventually the sound faded, and she was left alone with the weight of her own declarations. The master came to her that evening as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. He found her in the library, curled in one of the leather chairs with a book of poetry open in her lap. He did not announce himself, simply appeared in the doorway and watched her, until she sensed his presence and looked up. "Lady Seraphine came to see you," he said. It was not a question. She nodded, said things she needed to say. He moved into the room, selected a book from the shelves without looking at the title, and sat in the chair opposite hers. "And what did you say in return?" "That strength is not the same as surrender. That I will not make myself smaller to ease anyone's discomfort, not even hers. Not even yours." He looked up sharply, surprise flickering across his face. "Mine, yours," she confirmed. "If what is between us requires me to be less than I am, then it is not what I want. I have spent my life being told I am too much, too large, too present, too hungry for space and air and life. I will not do it anymore, not for comfort or safety or love or anything else." He was silent for a long moment, the book forgotten in his hands. Then quietly, "I do not want you smaller. I never did. I want you exactly as you are, in all your terrifying entirety. It is the world that needs to change, not you." Something loosened in her chest, a knot she had not realized she was carrying. She set aside her poetry and rose, crossing to where he sat, kneeling before him the way he had knelt before her when he bandaged her hand. She took the book from his grasp and set it aside, then placed her palms on his knees. feeling the cool reality of him beneath her touch. "Then let us change it," she said. "Together. Let us build something that makes room for both of us." His hands covered hers, and the contact sent warmth spiraling through her veins. "Yes," he breathed. "Yes." They began to walk the corridors together after that, not hiding but not flaunting either. Simply existing in the same space, their footsteps echoing through the ancient halls. The servants noticed. Of course they noticed, but their whispers changed quality, transforming from scandalized gossip into something closer to wonder. Helena, the kind woman who left bread by her door, finally approached her directly one afternoon in the kitchen gardens. The young woman was cutting herbs for the evening meal, having discovered that keeping her hands busy helped her think, when Helena appeared at the garden gate with her anxious expression and worried hands. "May I speak with you?" Helena asked, and the young woman gestured to the bench beneath the apple tree. They sat together in the dappled shade, and for a moment Helena simply looked at her, as if trying to reconcile what she saw with what she had been told to believe. Finally she spoke. "I have a daughter," she said, 12 years old. "She is growing into her body and hating every moment of it. She hides herself in layers of clothing, refuses to eat more than necessary, cries when the other children make their comments. I try to tell her she is perfect, that her body is a gift, but she hears me with my voice in your face, and I realize I have no answer that makes sense." The young woman set down her basket of herbs and turned to face Helena fully. "What would you like me to tell her?" "That it gets easier," Helena said immediately. "That someday she will find someone who sees her beauty. That her body is not a burden to be overcome, but a part of her to be cherished." The young woman considered this, weighing truth against comfort, and decided Helena's daughter deserved honesty. "Tell her," she said slowly, "that it does not get easier, but she gets stronger. That beauty is not something given to us by others' eyes, but something we claim for ourselves despite everything. That her body will never stop being a battlefield, but she can choose whether to fight against it or alongside it. And tell her that she is not alone, even when she feels most isolated. Tell her there is a woman in a castle who understands, and who promises her that survival is possible, and survival can even become joy." Helena's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out to grip the young woman's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for staying. Thank you for being here where she can know you exist." After Helena left, the young woman remained in the garden as shadows lengthened and the air grew cool. She thought about all the daughters growing into bodies the world told them were wrong. All the young women learning to hate themselves before they even understood what they were hating. She thought about her mother who had loved her fiercely in those early years before poverty and illness took her, who had given her the moon pendant and told her she was made of light. The master found her there as evening deepened into night, her face tilted up toward the first stars. He sat beside her without speaking, and they watched the sky together until she finally broke the silence. "Helena has a daughter who hates her body," she said. "I told her to tell the girl that it does not get easier, but we get stronger. Was that wrong? Should I have lied and said someday the world will change?" "No," he said firmly. "The kindest thing we can offer is truth. And the truth is that the world changes slowly, but we can change faster. We can refuse to accept its judgments. We can build spaces where different rules apply. Like this castle," she said. "Like this castle," he agreed. "Like us." She turned to him then, studying his profile in the starlight. He was beautiful in a way that hurt to look at directly. All sharp angles and impossible grace. But there was also something in his expression that made him real, vulnerable. He caught her looking and smiled, a small expression that transformed his entire face. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I am falling in love with a vampire," she said, and the words came out steadier than she expected. "That I am terrified and exhilarated and confused all at once. That I do not know how this ends, but I know I cannot walk away from it." His smile faded, replaced by something more serious. "And if I told you that I am falling in love with a human, that I have not felt this way in centuries, that the thought of losing you now would unmake me entirely, what would you say to that?" "I would say," she replied, "that we are both fools. And that being a fool together is better than being wise alone." He laughed then, a sound she had never heard from him, genuine and unguarded. It rang through the garden like bells, and she found herself laughing with him, both of them caught in the absurdity and beauty of what they were attempting. The weeks that followed established new rhythms. They took meals together in his study rather than the vast dining hall, sitting across from each other at a small table by the window, discussing books and philosophy and the small observations that make up daily life. He told her about the centuries he had lived, the empires he had watched rise and crumble, the ways that humanity repeated its mistakes with minor variations. She told him about the orphanage, about the matrons who meant well but could not see past their assumptions, about her mother's hands and the smell of bread and the weight of silver moons against her skin. They played chess in the evenings, her skills improving slowly as he taught her strategy and patience. Sometimes he would catch her hand mid-move, holding it suspended over the board, and they would stay frozen in that moment of potential until one of them broke the spell with a laugh or a sigh. She explored the castle more freely now, discovering rooms that seemed to appear only when she needed them, a conservatory filled with night-blooming flowers that released their perfume only in darkness, a music room with instruments from centuries past, their strings humming when she walked by as if remembering old songs. A gallery of portraits showing his family through the generations, their faces serious and sad, as if they had known even then what their legacy would become. And slowly, hesitantly, they began to touch. Not with the urgency of passion, but with the careful curiosity of people learning a new language. His hand on her shoulder as they looked at stars together, her fingers brushing his cheek when he seemed lost in dark thoughts. The press of their palms when they walked through gardens at twilight. Each contact was a question and an answer, a negotiation of boundaries and permissions, an acknowledgement that what was growing between them required tenderness above all else. One evening, as rain drummed against the windows and turned the world beyond into liquid shadow, they sat together on the couch in his study, her back against his chest, his arms around her waist. She could feel his breath against her hair, steady and cool, and the solid reality of his body supporting hers. It was not desire exactly, though desire was certainly present. It was something more fundamental, the recognition that they fit together, that the space they created between them was safer than any space they had occupied alone. "Tell me your name," he said softly against her ear. "Your real name. Not the one they called you at the orphanage, not the labels they assigned you here. The name your mother gave you." She was silent for a moment, surprised by the question. She had not spoken it aloud in years, had almost forgotten the shape of it in her mouth. But here, held in the circle of his arms with rain surrounding them, it felt safe to remember. "Ilara," she whispered. "My name is Ilara." "Ilara," he repeated, and the name sounded different in his voice, like a prayer or an invocation. "Ilara, bearer of moonlight. It suits you. And yours," she asked. "What is your name? Not your title. Not what they call you in fear or formality. What did your mother name you when you were born?" Another long silence, and she felt tension enter his frame. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. "Marcus," he said finally. "Though I have not heard that name spoken with love since before I changed. Thank you for asking. Thank you for caring to know." She turned in his arms so she could see his face. "Marcus," she said, testing it, tasting it. "It is a good name. Strong and simple and real. I will use it if you permit." "Please," he breathed. "Please do." They stayed that way through the night, wrapped around each other as the storm raged beyond the castle walls. Two people finding shelter in the center of something neither of them fully understood, but both were willing to trust. The castle, which had been silent for so long, began to wake. Servants noticed it first, the way the air moved differently through the corridors, carrying warmth where before there had been only chill. The way flowers appeared in vases overnight, blooming in colors that should not exist. The way the stones themselves seemed to hum with something that felt almost like contentment. Helena's daughter came to visit, a girl named Sarah with her mother's anxious hands and a face caught between childhood and something else. Ilara met her in the conservatory, surrounded by night-blooming jasmine and moonflowers, and they sat together on a stone bench while the girl worked up courage to speak. "My mother says you are kind," Sarah finally said, "that you understand what it feels like to be wrong in your own skin." Ilara nodded slowly. "I do understand. And I also understand that there are no easy answers, nothing I can say that will make it hurt less right now. But I can tell you that you are not broken, no matter what anyone says. You are becoming, and becoming is messy and painful and strange. But it is also the most human thing we do. Sarah looked at her with eyes too old for her face. Does it ever stop hurting? No, Elara admitted. But you learn to carry the hurt differently. You learn that pain can coexist with joy, that you can hate parts of your experience and still find beauty in others. You learn that survival is its own kind of grace. They talked for an hour about bodies and expectations and the small cruelties of growing up visible. When Sarah finally left, she walked with her spine a little straighter, her shoulders a little less hunched. Helena, waiting outside the conservatory, caught Elara's eye and mouthed thank you with an expression that spoke of maternal relief and gratitude. Marcus appeared beside Elara as she watched them leave. You are good with her, he observed. Natural. I remember being her, Elara said. I still am her in many ways. The girl who does not fit, who never will fit, who has to decide whether to break herself to match the mold or shatter the mold entirely. And which did you choose? He asked, though he already knew the answer. I chose the mold, she said with a small smile. Every time, in every way I could. He took her hand, lacing their fingers together. I am grateful, he said quietly, for every broken mold, for every act of defiance, for every moment that led you here. Winter settled over the castle like a held breath, transforming the forest into a study in black and white. Snow covered the paths and drifted against the walls, muting sound until even the wind seemed to speak in whispers. Elara discovered ice skating on the frozen pond in the western courtyard, and Marcus, who had not skated in 100 years, joined her despite his initial protests. They were clumsy together, holding each other upright, laughing when they fell in tangles of limbs and heavy coats. The servants who watched from windows smiled despite themselves, infected by the joy of seeing their master remember how to play. Even Lady Seraphine, passing through the courtyard on some urgent errand, paused to watch before shaking her head and continuing on her way. On the longest night of winter, Marcus led Elara to the highest tower, where a telescope stood pointed at the heavens. They spent hours there watching stars wheel overhead while he told her their stories, the myths and legends different cultures had woven around the same celestial patterns. She listened with her head on his shoulder, occasionally asking questions, more often simply absorbing the sound of his voice and the warmth of his presence beside her. As midnight approached, he turned the telescope toward the moon, adjusting the focus until its cratered surface filled the lens. Look, he said, and she pressed her eye to the viewer. The moon hung vast and detailed, every scar and shadow visible, beautiful in its imperfection. She thought of her pendant, the simplified silver circle her mother had given her, and understood suddenly that the gift had been about this. Seeing beauty in the marked and damaged, finding light in the dark. My mother used to say I was made of moonlight, she told Marcus as she stepped back from the telescope. I never understood what she meant. I thought it was just something parents say to their children, meaningless comfort. But now I think she meant that I carry light even in darkness, that my value does not depend on what others can see but on what I know is there. Marcus pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her from behind, and they stood together looking up at the real moon with their own eyes. You are made of moonlight, he said, and I have been darkness for so long that I forgot what it felt like to be illuminated. Thank you for reminding me. They kissed then, finally, a meeting of lips that had been weeks in the building. It was gentle and searching, a question asked with breath and answered with sighs. When they finally separated, both were trembling. Not from cold, but from the recognition of how much more there was to discover. Spring arrived late but insistent, pushing through the last snows with green shoots and birdsong. The castle grounds transformed into something alive, gardens that had been neglected for years suddenly bursting with colour as if celebrating. Elara spent hours outside, her hands in the soil, coaxing flowers back to life while Marcus watched from the terrace, content to see her happy. They had settled into a rhythm that felt both sustainable and precious, a balance between togetherness and independence that respected both their needs. She still slept in her tower room, needing that space of her own, but many evenings she would fall asleep in his study with a book on her chest. and he would carry her to bed without waking her. He still kept some of his old habits, disappearing for days at a time to handle estate business or attend to the darker necessities of his nature. But he always returned to her with stories of the world beyond the castle walls. On the anniversary of her arrival, exactly 1 year since they had brought her in disgrace and fear, Marcus asked her to meet him in the great hall where they had first stood together. She dressed carefully in a gown of deep blue that made her skin glow, braided moonflowers into her hair, and wore her mother's pendant visible against her throat. When she entered the hall, she found it transformed. Every surface held candles, hundreds of them, their flames turning the space into a cathedral of light. Marcus stood in the center dressed in formal black, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked nervous, she realized with surprise. This ancient creature who had faced centuries with composure was nervous before her. "Ilara," he said as she approached, "a year ago you came to this place as punishment. You were meant to remind me of power and position, to reinforce the hierarchies I had always accepted without question. Instead, you showed me what I had forgotten, that cruelty is a choice, that love is possible even when it should not be, that the heart can learn to beat again after centuries of silence." He dropped to one knee, and her breath caught in her throat. "I cannot offer you a normal life," he continued. "I cannot give you day instead of night, warmth instead of cold, mortality instead of the eternity I carry. But I can offer you my entirety such as it is. My name, my home, my heart, all the broken and strange pieces of what I am. Will you stay? Not as guest or prisoner or experiment, but as partner? As equal? As the one who makes the castle sing?" She closed the distance between them, placed her hands on his shoulders, and felt the tremor running through his frame. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it. Yes to you." He rose and kissed her then, deep and fierce, pouring into that contact everything he could not say with words. When they finally separated, both were crying, salt water mixing with moonlight as the candles burned around them. They married in the garden at midnight under a full moon, with only Helena and her daughter as witnesses. There was no priest, no formal ceremony, just the two of them speaking vows they had written themselves, promising to see each other truly, to make space for growth and change, to build something new from the pieces of what had been broken. He gave her a ring of silver and onyx, dark stone set in pale metal, and she gave him one of moonstone and platinum, light held in darkness. They exchanged them with shaking hands and sealed the promises with a kiss that tasted of beginning. The scandal never fully died, but it transformed. What had been whispered as shameful became whispered as romantic. The lords who had fled eventually returned, chastened and curious, and found the castle changed in ways they could not articulate. The servants moved through the halls singing songs that had not been heard in generations. The gardens bloomed without cease, and at the center of it all, two people who should not have fit together walked hand in hand, making room for each other in a world that had insisted there was no room at all. Years passed. The castle stood firm against time's erosion, held together by something stronger than stone or mortar. Ilara learned the rhythms of vampiric life, the way nights stretched long and intimate, the way darkness became not a threat but a shelter. Marcus learned to see through her eyes, to notice the small beauties of daily existence he had stopped perceiving centuries ago. They had their struggles. There were nights when his nature overwhelmed him and he withdrew, afraid of hurting her with his hunger. There were days when she felt the weight of immortality looming and wondered what she was becoming. But they had also learned to speak these fears aloud, to bring them into the light where they could be examined and understood. Helena's daughter, Sarah, grew into a woman who carried herself with confidence earned through struggle. She visited often, bringing with her other young women from the village who needed to see that survival was possible. That beauty came in forms the world had not taught them to recognize. Ilara welcomed them all, creating a space where questions could be asked and truths could be spoken without shame. The castle, which had been a place of fear and isolation for so long, became a sanctuary. Word spread slowly through villages and towns. There was a place where those who did not fit could find shelter, where judgment gave way to curiosity, where the standard of worth was measured not by appearance or conformity, but by the courage to keep existing, despite everything. On quiet evenings, when the castle was still and the stars bright overhead, Ilara and Marcus would return to that tower where they had first kissed under winter sky. They would look at the moon together, remembering the journey that had brought them from that moment to this, and feel gratitude for every difficult step along the way. Sometimes Marcus would pull out the white rose, the one he had left outside her door that first week, preserved somehow through all the years. It had never wilted, frozen in perpetual bloom, defying nature the way their love defied expectation. He would place it in her hand and watch as she lifted it to the moonlight, seeing in its frost-edged petals a metaphor for everything they had built together. "You saved me," he told her once during one of these quiet moments. "Not from death, but from forgetting how to live." "No," she corrected gently. "We saved each other. You gave me permission to take up space, and I gave you a reason to want to occupy it. Neither of us is the same person we were, and that is exactly as it should be." They kissed then, slow and sweet, with the patience of people who know they have time. The moon watched them as it had always watched, impartial and beautiful, casting its light on the just and unjust alike. And in that light, two figures stood intertwined, casting a single shadow, proof that the impossible could become inevitable with nothing more than choice and courage, and the willingness to see what others refused to recognize. The castle never slept silently again. There was always movement in its corridors, always life in its rooms, always the sound of voices raised in conversation or laughter or song. The weight that had pressed down on its stones for centuries lifted gradually, replaced by something lighter, something that felt almost like hope. And on the anniversary of each year's first night together, Marcus and Ilara would return to the Great Hall where everything had changed. They would light the same candles, stand in the same space, and remember the moment when a punishment became a choice, when shame transformed into recognition, when two people looked at each other and decided that what the world offered was not enough. In these moments, Ilara would touch the moon pendant at her throat and think of her mother, who had known even in poverty and illness that her daughter carried light. She would think of all the years of being told she was too much, all the eyes that had looked through her or past her, or with contempt. And she would feel something that might have been forgiveness, not for those who had hurt her, but for herself, for the years she had believed them. Marcus would watch her face in the candlelight and see that everything he had lost and found again. Vulnerability and strength, softness and steel, the infinite capacity to endure and still choose kindness. He would take her hand, lacing their fingers together, and feel the steady beat of her pulse against his palm. Reminder that mortality and eternity could coexist in the space between two people who refused to let go. The world beyond the castle continued its ancient patterns. Cycles of cruelty and beauty, judgment and grace. The eternal struggle between what was and what could be. But inside these walls, something new had taken root. Not a solution to the world's problems. Not an answer that could be exported or explained, but a small pocket of possibility. A proof that the rules were not as fixed as everyone believed. Sarah married. Eventually, a gentleman from the village who loved her exactly as she was. They held their wedding in the castle garden, surrounded by flowers that bloomed in impossible colours. And Ilara stood as witness with tears streaming down her face. When Sarah exchanged her vows, speaking words about being seen and choosing each other despite everything, she looked directly at Ilara and mouthed, "Thank you," in a way that needed no voice. More people came over the years. Some stayed, finding positions in the household or cottages on the grounds. Others visited and returned to their lives with something changed in their hearts, a small seed of rebellion against the judgments they had internalized. The castle became a kind of way station, a place between one life and another where transformation was not only possible but expected. Lady Seraphine eventually softened, though she would never admit it outright. She could be found sometimes in the kitchen late at night, helping Helena prepare meals for the constant stream of visitors. Her movements efficient and practiced, her face almost peaceful. When Ilara encountered her during these moments, they would nod to each other with something approaching respect. Two women who had stood on opposite sides of a line and learned that the line itself was illusion. The castle aged as all things age, but it aged gracefully, wearing its years like honor rather than burden. New stories layered over old ones, creating a palimpsest of memory and meaning that seeped into the very stones. Children who had grown up visiting brought their own children, and the cycle continued. Each generation learning from the one before that worth was not determined by fitting in, but by the courage to stand out. And through it all, at the center of everything, too, people continued their dance. Not perfect, never perfect, but real in a way that mattered. They argued sometimes, needed space sometimes, hurt each other with careless words or forgotten needs. But they also learned to apologize, to forgive, to try again with more care and less assumption. They learned that love was not a destination but a practice, something that required attention and intention, and the willingness to keep choosing each other day after night after day. On particularly difficult evenings, when the weight of the world pressed too heavy or old fears resurfaced, they would find each other in the darkness and simply hold on. No words necessary. Just the solid reality of another body, another heartbeat, another soul that had decided they were worth the effort of staying. Marcus painted her portrait once, working for months to capture not just her physical form, but the essence of who she was. When he finally showed it to her, she saw herself through his eyes for the first time, strong and beautiful and whole. Every curve a celebration rather than apology, her gaze direct and unafraid. The moon pendant at her throat catching light like a promise kept. She cried when she saw it, and he held her while she wept, understanding that these were tears of recognition, of finally seeing what he had seen from that very first night. The painting hung in the great hall, replacing the portraits of long-dead ancestors who had ruled through fear and distance. Visitors would stop before it, drawn by something they could not quite name, and leave feeling slightly changed, as if they had glimpsed a possibility they had not known existed. Ilara never forgot where she came from. She visited the orphanage once, years after everything had changed, bringing gifts and stories and proof that survival was possible. The matrons who remained were older now, their certainties softened by time, and they received her with something approaching shame. But she had not come for apology or revenge. She had come for the girls who still lived there, the ones who were learning to hate themselves before they had a chance to understand who they might become. She told them her story, not the fairy tale version, but the true one, full of fear and pain and the slow work of learning to take up space. She told them that the world would try to make them small, that people would insist they were too much in every direction, that shame would be offered as if it were love. And then she told them that they could refuse. That refusal was possible, that surviving the world's judgment was only the beginning, and beyond survival lay something that might even be joy. When she left, she carried with her letters from girls who had no one else to write to, and she answered everyone, sending back words of encouragement and understanding, building a web of connection that stretched beyond the castle walls. Some of those girls eventually made their way to the castle themselves, and the cycle continued, each person who had been hurt learning to help heal others. Marcus watched all of this with something approaching awe. He had lived centuries believing that change was impossible, that natures were fixed and people were defined by their limitations. But Ilara had shown him that the only real limitation was imagination, that the world could be remade one person at a time through the simple act of refusing to accept what had always been. They grew old together, or rather, she aged while he remained unchanged. And this became its own negotiation. She had known from the beginning that she would weather while he stayed frozen, but knowing something and living it were different experiences. The first grey hair, the first line that did not fade, the small accumulations of time marking her while he remained untouched. They talked about it, as they talked about everything. She told him her fears of becoming invisible as youth faded, of losing whatever spark had drawn him to her. He told her that he had not fallen in love with youth, but with courage, with the specific soul that animated her body. And that soul only grew more beautiful as it accumulated experience and wisdom. And to prove it, he commissioned another portrait and then another, marking the years as they passed, creating a gallery of her changing face that showed not loss, but evolution. Each painting captured something new, laugh lines earned through joy, strength deepened by struggle, peace that came from acceptance. Together, they formed a visual argument against the world's obsession with preservation, proof that change itself could be beautiful. On her 50th birthday, they held a celebration in the Great Hall, inviting everyone who had been touched by the castle's transformation. The room filled with people of every age and shape and story, and they raised glasses to the woman who had refused to be small, who had chosen expansion over contraction, who had loved a monster until he remembered his humanity. Sarah's daughter, now a young woman herself, gave a toast that made everyone weep. She spoke of growing up knowing that her grandmother's friend had changed the world not through grand gestures, but through the persistent act of existing without apology. She spoke of learning from that example, of carrying it forward, of teaching her own future children that worth was not measured by conformity, but by the courage to be precisely who you were. Ilara listened with Marcus's hand in hers, feeling the weight of years and gratitude, overwhelmed by the recognition that the small choices she had made, the daily decisions to keep standing in her truth, had created ripples that reached further than she could have imagined. In her 60s, her body began to slow in ways that could not be ignored. Joints that had always carried her became reluctant. Breath that had been reliable turned uncertain. Marcus watched with barely concealed fear, counting each new limitation as a countdown to loss he did not know how to survive. She found him one evening in his study, staring at nothing, his face a mask of controlled devastation. She lowered herself into the chair beside him, moving carefully, and took his cold hand in her warm one. "I am not leaving you," she said quietly. "Not yet. Not for years still, if I have anything to say about it. But even when I do, even when this body finally gives out, I will not be gone. I will be in every room we transform together. I will be in every person we helped learn to stand tall. I will be in every choice you make to keep honoring what we built. Death is real, but so is legacy, and ours is too strong to die. What if I cannot do this without you?" he whispered. "What if the darkness comes back and I forget everything you taught me? Then you will remember again," she said firmly. "Because you did not learn it from me? You knew it already, buried beneath centuries of pain and survival. I just helped you excavate it. And once something is excavated, once it is brought into light, it does not return to darkness easily. You will stumble sometimes, you will doubt, but you will not forget." He pulled her close then, careful of her fragile bones, and they stayed that way until dawn began to threaten the horizon. When they finally separated, his face was wet with tears that looked like blood in the candlelight, and she wiped them away with tender fingers, marking herself with his sorrow in an act of communion. They made plans, practical and emotional, for the future that would come. He established foundations in her name, ensuring the castle would continue its work after she was gone. She wrote letters to the people she loved, words of encouragement and blessing to be opened when she could no longer speak them herself. They planted a garden of white roses, tended by both of them, that would bloom long after her hands could no longer work the soil. And through it all, they continued to find joy. Not the desperate joy of people trying to outrun time, but the deep satisfaction of those who know they have lived fully, who can look back without major regrets, who have loved and been loved in return. They still walked the corridors at night, her steps slower now, his patience infinite. They still read together by firelight, her voice sometimes trailing off as sleep claimed her, his voice picking up the story seamlessly. They still found each other in the darkness and held on, choosing each other with every breath until breathing itself would no longer be a choice she could make. The end, when it came, was gentle. She fell asleep in their bed with the moon shining through the window, his arms around her, her hand clutching the silver pendant that had traveled with her through every transformation. He felt the moment her breath stopped, the exact second her heart completed its final beat, and something in him shattered so completely that the sound of it echoed through the castle, shattering every mirror in sympathy. He held her through the night, memorizing the weight of her, the scent of her, the precise way her body folded into his. When dawn threatened, he finally released her, laying her out with care, placing white roses on her chest, closing her eyes with fingers that trembled. Then he walked from the room and sealed the door behind him, unable to face what remained now that she was no longer in it. The funeral drew hundreds. People came from villages and cities, from places even Marcus did not know the castle's influence had reached. They filled the grounds and spilled into the forest, all of them carrying something of Elara with them, a memory, a lesson, a moment when she had seen them truly and given them permission to see themselves. They buried her in the garden she had loved, beneath the white roses with her mother's pendant returned to her throat. Marcus stood at the grave's edge and could not speak, could not form. Words could only stand there leaking silent tears while others offered eulogies that captured pieces of her but never the whole. Sarah spoke, her voice strong despite crying. She told the story of a girl who had hated herself and a woman who had taught her that hate was not mandatory, that love was always an option even when it felt impossible. She spoke of transformation not as magic but as choice, repeated day after day until the new way of being became natural as breath. Helena spoke, remembering the servant who had become a lady not through title but through grace, who had never forgotten where she came from and had used that memory to ensure others did not have to walk the same painful path alone. Others spoke, adding their stories to the tapestry, weaving a picture of a life that had mattered deeply to many people. And through it all, Marcus stood silent, barely breathing, feeling the loss of her like a physical wound that would never heal. The castle mourned with him. Servants moved through halls in hushed reverence. The roses in the garden bloomed with desperate intensity, as if trying to compensate for her absence. The rooms where she had spent the most time seemed colder, emptier, despite fires that burned as hot as ever. Marcus withdrew into himself, spending days in his study staring at her portraits, nights walking the corridors she had walked, trying to trace her presence in the stones. He stopped eating, stopped attending to business, stopped doing anything except existing in the space between breath and dissolution. It was Sarah who finally forced him back to life. She appeared at his study door one evening, letting herself in without invitation, and found him sitting in darkness before a cold fireplace. "She would be furious with you," Sarah said without preamble. "Sitting here like this, letting everything she built crumble because you are too sad to continue. She loved you enough to stay human until the end, rather than choosing your immortality, and you honor that choice by dying while still breathing. That is not grief, that is selfishness." The words were harsh enough to penetrate his fog. He turned to look at Sarah, seeing in her face both her mother's kindness and Elara's steel, and felt something crack open inside him. "I do not know how to do this without her," he admitted. "Every moment feels wrong. Every breath is betrayal because she cannot breathe anymore. How do I keep existing when the person who taught me how to live is gone?" "You do it because she asked you to," Sarah said more gently. "Because the alternative is letting everything she fought for die with her. Because there are still people who need what this place offers, and you are the only one who can ensure it continues. Because love does not end with death, and the best way to honor her is to keep living the truth she showed you." He looked at her for a long moment, and then, slowly, he nodded. She was right. Elara would not want him to stop. She would want him to continue, to keep building, to ensure that the castle remained a place where transformation was possible. He owed her that much. He owed himself that much. So he began again. Slowly, painfully, he returned to the work they had started together. He met with visitors, offered sanctuary to those who needed it, maintained the gardens and the programs, and the careful balance of safety and challenge that made the castle special. It hurt every moment, a constant ache of absence. But he did it anyway, carrying her with him in memory and purpose. The portraits of Elara remained in the Great Hall, and he added to them over time, commissioning artists to paint her from photographs and memory, showing her at every age, in every mood, capturing the full scope of who she had been. Visitors would stop before them, drawn by the progression, by the visible proof that beauty could deepen with age rather than fade, that wrinkles and grey hair and changing bodies were evidence of life fully lived. Years passed again, measured now in seasons rather than days, each one carrying him further from their time together, but also deeper into the work they had shared. The castle continued to transform lives, and with each person helped, Marcus felt her presence more clearly. She was in the laughter of girls learning to love their bodies. She was in the quiet conversations between people finding courage. She was in every moment when someone chose to expand rather than contract, to stand rather than hide. He never loved again, not in the romantic sense. That part of him had been claimed fully by Alara, and he had no desire to diminish what they had shared by trying to recreate it. But he learned other forms of love, the satisfaction of mentoring young people finding their paths, the warmth of community built over decades, the deep peace of knowing his existence had purpose beyond mere survival. On the anniversary of her death, every year he would spend the night in the garden by her grave. He would tell her about the year that had passed, the people they had helped, the changes in the world beyond the castle. He would update her on Sarah's family, on the continued growth of the sanctuary they had built, on the small triumphs and occasional setbacks that made up daily life. And he would thank her for seeing him when he was invisible to himself, for teaching him that monsters were made not born and therefore could be unmade, for loving him with a generosity that defied every reasonable boundary, for staying mortal despite the offer of eternity, choosing fully human life over the half-existence that was all he could share, for leaving behind a legacy so strong that he could continue it even in her absence. The moon would watch over these vigils, waxing and waning in its eternal cycle, and sometimes Marcus would touch the white roses growing over her grave and swear he could feel her still, present in the stems and petals, transformed but not gone, alive in every living thing that refused to accept the world's limitations. Time became strange for him, centuries passing in what felt like heartbeats. The mortal lives around him, flowering and fading while he remained. But unlike before Alara, he did not detach. He let himself feel each loss, each ending, understanding now that pain was the price of connection and connection was worth any price. The castle became legendary, whispered about in stories that grew more fantastical with each telling. People said it was a place where impossible things happened, where vampires learned to love and broken people learned to heal. The stories were never quite accurate, but they captured something true, that within those walls the rules were different, kinder, more interested in possibility than limitation. And at the center of every story, whether explicitly named or merely implied, was the woman who had arrived in disgrace and departed in grace, who had transformed not just one vampire, but an entire understanding of what was possible when people refused to accept the judgments imposed upon them. Marcus grew into the role of guardian of her legacy, protector of what they had built together. He was no longer the cold lord who had ruled through fear and distance. He was something new, something he could not have imagined in all his centuries. A creature of darkness dedicated to bringing light, a monster who had learned the full scope of his humanity, a being who had been saved not by redemption, but by being seen. A century after Elara's death, the castle had become something neither of them could have predicted. The sanctuary they had started grew into a network that stretched across regions, small havens established in villages and cities, where people who felt displaced by the world's demands could find community and support. Marcus had funded them all, working through intermediaries to protect his nature, while ensuring the work continued. Each place carried a version of the castle's spirit, that careful balance between acceptance and challenge, between comfort and growth. Sarah's great-great-granddaughter arrived at the castle one autumn evening, a young scholar studying the history of social movements and the ways small acts of resistance could reshape entire cultures. Her name was Elena, close enough to Elara's that Marcus felt his heart stutter when she introduced herself. She had her ancestors' eyes, direct and unafraid, and a notebook filled with questions about the castle's origins. They sat in the library where Elara had once found refuge, and Marcus told her the story. Not the sanitized version that had entered legend, but the true one, with all its messiness and fear and fumbling attempts at connection. He told her about the woman who had refused to be small, who had seen a monster and loved him anyway, who had built something beautiful from the ruins of shame. Elena listened with the intensity of someone recognizing their own story in another's, And when he finished, she was crying. "My whole life," she said, "I have felt like I was fighting a battle no one else could see. Fighting to take up space, to be heard, to matter despite every message telling me I should not. And all this time, my ancestor was fighting the same battle, and she won. She actually won. She won," Marcus agreed. But not because she defeated anyone. She won because she kept choosing herself, kept standing in her truth, until the world had no choice but to make room. That is the only way anyone wins this particular battle. Not through conquest, but through persistent presence. Eleanor stayed at the castle for months, documenting everything, interviewing the people who lived and worked there, tracing the web of influence that had spread from that one choice Marcus had made to defend a woman at a banquet. She wrote a book eventually, one that would be studied in universities, that would inspire new generations to question the hierarchies they inherited and to build spaces where different rules applied. But before she left, she did something Marcus had not expected. She brought him to Alara's grave and read aloud from her notes, passages about the power of love to transform not just individuals, but entire systems of belief. About how one person's refusal to accept shame could crack open possibilities for thousands who came after. About legacy as a living thing, growing and changing and adapting to new times while maintaining its essential truth. "She would be proud," Eleanor said when she finished. "Not just of what you built, but of who you became. You know that, right?" Marcus nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. He did know it. Felt it every day in the work, in the connections, in the moments when someone learned they did not have to shrink themselves to be worthy of love. After Eleanor left, Marcus found himself thinking about the future in ways he had not since Alara's death. The castle would outlive him, he realized. The work they had started would continue long after his existence ended, carried forward by people who had never met Alara but had been touched by her influence nonetheless. The thought brought him peace, a sense that what they had built together was real and solid and would endure. He began to teach more actively, taking on students who wanted to learn how to create sanctuaries in their own communities. He shared what he and Alara had learned about holding space for people in pain, about the difference between helping and fixing, about the importance of letting people define their own paths to healing. Some of his students were human, some were creatures like himself, all of them drawn by the same desire to build something better than what they had inherited. One of those students was a young vampire named Julian, turned against his will and struggling with the darkness that came with his new nature. He arrived at the castle broken, convinced he was a monster, ready to end his existence rather than continue as something inhuman. Marcus saw himself in Julian's despair, remembered what it felt like to believe transformation was impossible. They worked together for years, Marcus sharing everything Alara had taught him about choosing humanity moment by moment, about using power to protect rather than dominate, about finding purpose in service rather than control. Julian resisted at first, certain that Marcus was lying or deluded, that monsters could not change their fundamental nature. But slowly, through example and patience and the steady proof of the castle's existence, he began to believe. The night Julian finally smiled, genuinely smiled at something beautiful rather than something cruel. Marcus felt Alara's presence so strongly it was almost physical. She was there in the library where they sat, in the warmth of the fire, in the possibility that had just opened in another lost soul. She was there in every moment of choosing connection over isolation, love over fear, hope over resignation. "Thank you," Marcus whispered to the empty air, to the memory, to the woman who had saved him and continued saving others through him. "Thank you for showing me that change is possible, that monsters are made, not born. That love is always a choice, and choosing it can transform everything." The decades continued their march, and Marcus found himself becoming something he had never imagined. A teacher, a mentor, a guardian of transformation. People sought him out, drawn by rumors of the vampire who had learned to love, who had built a sanctuary from shame. He met with them all, shared his story, offered what guidance he could. Some left unchanged, too trapped in their own certainties to imagine different possibilities. But others felt something shift inside them, a crack in the armor they had built against hope, and through that crack, light could enter. The castle evolved with the times. adapting its methods while maintaining its core purpose. New technologies allowed them to reach more people, to create virtual communities for those who could not travel to the physical location. The sanctuary expanded into the digital realm, offering support and connection to people isolated by distance or circumstance. Marcus struggled with some of the changes, uncomfortable with screens and interfaces, but he recognized the essential truth: the medium mattered less than the message, and the message Alara had embodied was timeless. He received a letter one day from a woman in a distant city, someone he had never met, who wrote to tell him that his story with Alara had saved her life. She had been on the edge of ending everything, convinced that a world that could not accept her had no place for her existence. Then she read Elena's book, learned about the castle, understood that refusal was possible and survival could lead to joy. She was writing to say thank you and to promise that she would carry the message forward, would be for others what Alara had been for her, proof that transformation was possible. Marcus kept that letter in his desk drawer, returning to it on difficult days when the weight of continuing without Alara felt impossible to bear. It reminded him why the work mattered, why pushing through grief to maintain what they had built together was worth the constant ache of her absence. He was not doing this for himself anymore, if he ever had been. He was doing it for all the people who needed to know that another way existed, that shame was not inevitable, that love could be found even in the darkest places. On what would have been Alara's 200th birthday, had she lived, Marcus held a celebration at the castle. He invited everyone who had been touched by her legacy, and they came in numbers that overwhelmed even his expectations. The grounds filled with people of every description, all of them carrying stories of transformation, of learning to stand tall, of refusing to accept the limitations others tried to impose. They told their stories throughout the night, a chorus of voices weaving together into a tapestry of resistance and hope. Some spoke of bodies they had learned to love despite the world's contempt. Others spoke of identities they had claimed in defiance of expectation. Still others spoke of creativity unleashed, dreams pursued, lives lived fully instead of apologetically. And through every story ran the same thread. Someone had shown them that another way was possible, and that someone had been influenced, directly or indirectly, by the woman who had arrived at a castle as punishment and transformed it into sanctuary. Marcus listened to it all, feeling Alara present in every word, seeing her influence ripple outward in ways neither of them could have imagined when they first stood together in that great hall. She had been right, he realized. Death had not ended her. She lived in every person who chose expansion over contraction, in every act of self-love that defied judgment, in every community built on acceptance rather than hierarchy. She lived in the work, and the work was everywhere. As the celebration wound down and guests began to depart, Sarah's family approached him. 4 generations gathered together. They presented him with a gift, a painting they had commissioned, showing not Alara alone but Alara and Marcus together, standing in the garden with the castle behind them and the moon overhead. In the painting they were touching, his hand on her shoulder, her head tilted toward him, both of them looking directly at the viewer with expressions of quiet joy. "It is how we remember you together," Sarah's great-great-great-granddaughter explained, a child of perhaps 10 with Alara's eyes and Sarah's steel. "My grandmother says you showed us all that love can exist anywhere, between anyone, if people are brave enough to choose it. She says you proved that nothing is impossible when people refuse to believe the limitations they are taught." Marcus accepted the painting with hands that shook slightly, overwhelmed by the gift and the recognition it represented. He hung it in the great hall beside the portraits of Alara through the years, creating a visual narrative of their life together. Visitors who came after would stand before it, drawn by something in the way the 2 figures looked at each other. The obvious love that transcended every barrier that should have kept them apart. The centuries continued, and Marcus continued with them, carrying Alara forward in everything he did. He never stopped missing her, never stopped feeling the ache of her absence, but he learned to carry grief alongside joy, to let both coexist in the space of his continued existence. He learned what she had tried to teach him when she was alive, that pain was not something to overcome but something to integrate, another part of the full experience of being alive. He began to write, finally setting down their story in his own words. Not for publication or posterity, but for himself, a way of honoring what they had shared and ensuring he never forgot the lessons she had taught him. He wrote about the first night, when she had stood in the hall and refused to make herself small. He wrote about the slow building of trust, the careful negotiation of boundaries, the gradual recognition that what was growing between them was real. He wrote about their years together, the joys and struggles, the ways they had learned to see each other fully. And he wrote about her death, the grief that had nearly destroyed him, the slow return to purpose that had saved him. When he finished, he placed the manuscript in the library on a shelf where anyone who needed it could find it. He did not label it or announce its presence, trusting that the right people would discover it when they were ready. And they did. Over the years, people would find the manuscript and read it, and they would write to him or visit him to say thank you for the honesty, for showing that love was messy and difficult and worth every challenge. As his second century without Alara drew to a close, Marcus began to feel the pull of what came next. Not death exactly, for he was unsure if death would ever claim him, but transition, transformation into something else. The castle was secure, the work was thriving, and new guardians had risen to carry it forward. His role was changing from active participant to elder statesman, someone who advised and encouraged but no longer directed. He found peace in that shift, recognizing that Alara would approve. She had never wanted him to carry everything alone, had always insisted that building something sustainable meant creating systems that could function without any single person. The castle had become that, a living entity that would continue regardless of who led it, held together by shared purpose rather than individual will. On the 200th anniversary of Alara's death, Marcus returned to her grave alone. The garden had grown wild in beautiful ways, white roses tangling with other flowers, creating a riot of colour and scent that would have delighted her. He sat on the ground beside her headstone, feeling the earth beneath him, solid and real, and spoke to her as he had done so many times before. "I kept my promise," he said quietly. "The work continues. The castle stands. People are still finding their way here, still learning that transformation is possible. You are still saving lives even now, even after all this time." He paused, listening to the wind through the leaves, the distant sound of voices from the castle, the eternal song of life continuing despite death. "I miss you," he continued, "every day, every moment. But I am grateful for what we had, for what we built, for what continues because you refused to be small. You changed me. You changed the world, and that will never end. Not as long as there are people who need to hear that they are worthy exactly as they are." The moon rose as he sat there, full and bright, casting silver light across the garden. Marcus touched the roses growing over her grave, their petals soft beneath his fingers, and felt her presence as clearly as he had when she was alive. She was there in the flowers, in the moonlight, in the steady beat of his heart that she had taught to feel again. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything, for seeing me, for loving me, for teaching me what it means to be human. I will carry you forward for as long as I exist, and when I am gone, others will carry both of us. Love does not end. You taught me that. Love transforms, but it never truly dies." He stayed in the garden until dawn threatened, then rose and returned to the castle. There was work to do, people to help, a legacy to maintain, and he would do it gladly, carrying her memory and her truth forward into whatever future waited. Because that was what love required, not possession or preservation, but continuation, the willingness to keep choosing each day to honor what had been by building what could be. The castle stood against the sky, lights burning in its windows, voices echoing through its halls. Living proof that transformation was possible, that love could conquer isolation, that refusing to accept the world's judgments could create spaces where different rules applied. And at its heart, invisible but ever present, was the spirit of a woman who had arrived in disgrace and departed having changed everything. leaving behind a legacy that would endure as long as people needed to know that they were worthy of love exactly as they were. If this story found a reflection in you, leave a comment and share it. Sometimes the quietest pain is the most human.